The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Cecilia stood at the threshold of the mansion, her fingers lingering on the doorframe as she gazed at the once familiar walls of the family estate. It had been 5 years since she'd walked through these doors, and yet the house seemed unchanged, an intricate blend of opulence and coldness, just as she remembered it. She had made the decision to return, not out of nostalgia, but because she had no other choice. The world outside had closed its doors to her, and the only place that could give her answers, and a chance for revenge, was right here. She could feel the weight of the past bearing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it crush her. This time, she would not be the girl who had everything taken from her. As she stepped inside, a chill ran through her body, not from the cold but from the memories that flooded her mind. Elise's laughter, once so bright and carefree, now felt like an echo of betrayal. Her sister's face flashed before her eyes, a face that had been her only ally for so many years, but one that had turned on her when it mattered most. Cecilia shook off the feeling and walked through the halls with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. She didn't need to be reminded of how it had all unfolded. She had been the good sister, the obedient one, the one who sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of her family's legacy. And what had it gotten her? Betrayal. A life spent in the shadow of someone else's dreams. But not anymore. She had left the family home after the last blow, Elise's engagement to Victor, the man Cecilia had once loved. It had been a slow burn of disappointment, watching her sister take everything she had ever wanted, until finally, it was too much. Cecilia had packed her bags and left, determined to carve her own path. But the path had led her back here. Back to the place she had hoped to leave behind. Back to the place where her family's power and influence ruled everything. But this time, things would be different. She wasn't the naive girl who had followed Elise's lead. She was stronger now, more determined, and ready to take what was hers. The family business had always been something her father had wanted her to take over. But Elise had always been the one he trusted, the one he believed in. Now it was Cecilia's turn to prove herself. She wasn't going to let her sister walk all over her any longer. She could feel it, this place, these people. They didn't scare her anymore. Not like they used to. She had been broken before, yes, but now she was being rebuilt. And this time, she would be the one to control her fate. As Cecilia entered the living room, she noticed a familiar figure sitting by the window. The last person she had expected to find here, Victor. He was looking out over the estate grounds, his face as serious as ever. His broad shoulders were hunched slightly, and the faint lines around his eyes suggested exhaustion, but he still held the same commanding presence he always had. "Victor," Cecilia said, her voice steady, though a part of her wanted to scream. He was the reason she had left in the first place, the man who had once promised to stand by her side, only to turn his back on her for Elise. Victor's gaze turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her appearance. It had been years since they had last spoken, and the weight of that silence seemed to hang between them. "Cecilia," he greeted her, his tone flat, almost neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." Cecilia didn't answer immediately. She simply stepped into the room and took a seat across from him, her posture straight and confident. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" she said, her voice betraying nothing of the emotions swirling inside her. Victor's lips quirked in a half-smile. "I didn't think you'd ever come back, after everything." "After everything?" Cecilia repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You think I left because of Elise, because of you?" Victor stiffened, his expression hardening. "Isn't that why you left? You couldn't handle it, could you?" Cecilia leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "You're mistaken, Victor. I didn't leave because of Elise or you. I left because I had no place here, no power. I was always the shadow, the one everyone overlooked, the one everyone used, and now I'm here to take what's mine." There it was, the truth that she had buried for years. But now she could no longer hide it. She wanted control, she wanted power. And she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all her sister, stand in her way. Victor stared at her, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. "You think you can just walk back in here and take over? The company? The family?" "I don't think," Cecilia replied, her voice cool. "I know." Victor remained silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to gauge whether she was bluffing. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled, his gaze flickering to the window. "You're not the same girl you were." Cecilia smiled, her eyes darkening with resolve. "No, I'm not." The conversation with Victor left Cecilia with more questions than answers. She had expected resistance, but she had also expected to feel something, some lingering affection for the man who had once meant everything to her. But there was nothing, just emptiness. As the days passed, Cecilia began to observe more closely, taking note of everything happening within the company. Her father's health was deteriorating, and with it, the family's influence. But what was worse, she could see how much Elise had gained. Her sister had ingrained herself into the company's fabric, manipulating the board and securing alliances with some of the most powerful men in the business world. She had done this without Cecilia's knowledge. But that was about to change. Cecilia couldn't simply take back what was rightfully hers. It wasn't going to be easy. Elise had built a network of loyal allies who would do anything to protect her and her new position, but Cecilia was no fool. She knew how to navigate power struggles. She knew how to manipulate the right people. And she had the one thing Elise didn't, the knowledge of the past. Cecilia began making connections, quietly approaching those who had once worked with her father, gathering information, and learning the inner workings of the company. Every day, she made progress, slow, methodical, but progress nonetheless. She knew Elise would never suspect her, not yet, but Cecilia wasn't going to wait forever. She had one shot at this, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. The night was quieter than usual. Cecilia stood by the window of her new temporary office, her gaze fixed on the city below. The lights were bright and endless, a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. There was no going back now. She had made her decision, and now it was time to execute her plan. It would be a battle, no doubt, but it was a battle she was ready for. Her sister Elise had taken everything, but now Cecilia was going to take it all back. She would not let Elise's selfishness and manipulations define their family's future. Cecilia had always been seen as the quiet, reserved one, the one who followed the rules. But now, she was realizing how much power she had hidden within her. It had been buried for so long, forced down by the expectations of being the obedient daughter. But all of that was about to change. She wasn't going to sit in the shadows anymore. She would rise up, not only to reclaim what she was owed, but to make sure her sister knew exactly who was the true heir to the family legacy. The following morning, Cecilia met with her first ally, a member of the board of directors who had been loyal to her father for years. Mr. Parker was a sharp businessman, intelligent and well-respected, but he had always been overshadowed by Elise's manipulations. Today, however, things were different. Cecilia was no longer the girl who lacked confidence, and she could see the shift in Mr. Parker's eyes as she entered the meeting room. "Miss Moore," he greeted her formally, offering a handshake that felt more like a test than a greeting. "Mr. Parker," Cecilia replied, her voice steady and assured, "I need your help." She could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. For all his loyalty to her father, he had been a passive player in the drama that unfolded between her and Elise. He had been waiting for someone to take charge, to rise up and reclaim what had been lost. "Help?" he repeated, his eyebrows knitting together. "What do you mean exactly?" Cecilia leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I'm taking back control of this company, Mr. Parker. Elise has been running things into the ground. It's time we fix this." For a moment, there was silence as Mr. Parker processed her words. Then he smiled, a small but knowing smile. He had waited for this moment longer than anyone realized. "I knew you'd come back for it," he said quietly, as if to himself. "You have the fire your father had. It's been missing for too long." Cecilia didn't flinch. "I'm not here to play games. I want the board's support. I'm not asking, Mr. Parker. I'm telling you, we're going to take back what's ours." Mr. Parker paused, considering her words carefully. "You know, Miss Moore, Elise won't give up easily. She has allies, people who will stand by her, regardless of what's right." Cecilia didn't blink. "I'm not interested in what she thinks she owns. I've spent years watching her destroy what we built. It's time for a change, and it starts with me." With Mr. Parker's quiet but undeniable support, Cecilia set the wheels in motion. She began making calculated moves, talking to influential board members, reviewing financials, and gathering evidence of the mismanagement Elise had allowed to fester under her leadership. The more Cecelia uncovered, the clearer it became. Elise had been out of her depth, relying on her charm and manipulation to mask the cracks in the company. It was a house of cards, and Cecelia was ready to knock it all down. But every step she took was met with resistance, especially from her sister. Elise had begun to catch wind of Cecilia's movements, though she had no idea just how far her sister had come. Elise was still playing the role of the doting fiancée to Victor, pretending to be the perfect woman for the company, but Cecelia saw through it. She knew Elise's weakness. She had always known. As Cecelia continued her plan, she began to notice a shadow lingering in the background. It was not her sister. It was someone else, someone she hadn't expected to become a rival. Victor. He had been distant ever since Cecelia returned, and while she hadn't expected him to be her ally, she also hadn't expected him to become her adversary so quickly. One evening, as Cecelia was preparing to leave the office, she ran into him in the hallway. His presence loomed in the corridor like an ominous storm cloud. "Cecelia," he greeted her, his voice cool. "I see you're getting cozy in our family's company." Cecelia raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "It's mine too, Victor. Or have you forgotten?" Victor's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game. Elise won't let you take this from her, and I won't let you destroy everything my father has worked for." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm fixing what was broken. Your father allowed Elise to take over. I'm just taking what belongs to me." Victor moved closer, his presence threatening. "You think you can just waltz in here and reclaim everything? You think you're the heir to this family? You've been gone for years." Cecilia's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't need anyone's approval, Victor. Not from you, not from Elise. I'm doing what should have been done years ago. This company was never yours to inherit. It was mine." Victor's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Cecelia thought he might say something more. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away without another word. But Cecelia could see the anger and fear in his eyes. He knew she was right. Over the next week, Cecilia's plan continued to unfold, but it wasn't without complications. Elise was growing more suspicious, asking questions, trying to undermine Cecilia's efforts at every turn. It was clear that her sister wasn't willing to back down without a fight, but Cecelia was prepared. She had never underestimated Elise before, but now, she saw her for what she truly was, a woman desperate to hold on to power, even if it meant destroying the family she claimed to love. And Cecelia wasn't going to let that happen. The moment of tension arrived sooner than Cecelia expected. Elise had learned about Cecilia's meetings with the board, and she had made her move, firing off a series of emails to their father's former associates, trying to discredit Cecelia at every turn. It was a tactical strike. Elise was trying to paint Cecelia as a threat, someone who would ruin the company's legacy. She was pushing back in a way Cecelia hadn't anticipated. The board had started to waver, and Cecilia's position was no longer as secure as she had thought. But instead of faltering, Cecelia rose to the challenge. She called an emergency meeting with the board, intending to show them the truth about her sister's sabotage and how Elise's actions had caused irreparable damage to the company. She would not back down. But as Cecelia prepared for the showdown, she couldn't help but wonder, was she ready to go as far as it would take? To take everything from her sister and leave nothing behind? The answer was simple. Yes. The days following her encounter with Victor were tense. Cecelia had thought she was prepared, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the depth of the opposition she was up against. Elise was not simply trying to maintain control of the company. She was trying to destroy Cecilia's chances of reclaiming her birthright. The fight was no longer just about the company. It was about family, about loyalty, and about who would reign supreme. The stakes had risen, and Cecelia felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Cecelia spent the next few days in deep analysis. She knew Elise wouldn't be the only obstacle. The company's foundation had always been fragile, and now she was seeing just how far Elise's manipulation had spread. Not only had Elise corrupted internal relationships, but she had also damaged key business partnerships. Cecelia needed to act fast, or her sister's sabotage could have irreversible consequences. She sat at her desk, scrolling through the company's financial records, carefully looking for discrepancies. There were too many red flags, unapproved transactions, suspicious loans, and several accounts that had been drained without clear explanations. Elise had been hiding it all in plain sight, covering her tracks with a flawless facade. Cecelia gritted her teeth. She had to take action before it was too late. The next day, Cecelia found herself sitting across from her former mentor, Mr. Banks. He had been a trusted advisor to her father and had helped shape her understanding of the company, but that was before Elise had driven him away. "Cecelia," Mr. Banks greeted her, his tone cold but respectful. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I need your help," Cecelia said bluntly. "The company's in trouble. Elise has taken it down a dark path and I'm trying to fix it." Mr. Banks' eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You want me to help you fight your sister?" "Yes," Cecelia replied, her voice firm. "She's not fit to lead. I've uncovered evidence of fraud, mismanagement, and corruption, and I need your expertise to make sure it's brought to light." For a moment, Mr. Banks said nothing, just staring at her with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Finally, he spoke. "You understand this will put you in direct opposition to your sister, right?" Cecelia nodded. "I know, but if we don't act now, there may not be anything left to save." After a long pause, Mr. Banks sighed. "I'll help you, but be prepared, this won't be easy. Elise has her claws deep in the company, and she's not going down without a fight." With Mr. Banks on her side, Cecelia began to dig even deeper into the company's financial records. She uncovered more fraudulent transactions, some of which led to ghost companies created to siphon money away from the company's assets. But the deeper they went, the more they found. It wasn't just Elise who had been corrupting the company, it was a network of people she had surrounded herself with, people who had been feeding off the company's success. Victor's name appeared in several places, notably in the approval of questionable transactions. Cecelia clenched her fists in frustration. She knew Victor had been using his relationship with Elise to gain power, but she hadn't realized the extent of his involvement. He was more than just a bystander. He was complicit. She couldn't let him go unpunished. As Cecelia continued to investigate, she began to form alliances with other board members who were dissatisfied with Elise's leadership. One of these was Natalie Thomas, a senior vice president who had been with the company for over a decade. Natalie had always been loyal to Cecilia's father, and now she saw what Cecelia was doing as the only way to salvage the company's future. "I've been watching everything unfold from the sidelines," Natalie said one evening when Cecelia approached her. "Elise has destroyed everything your father built. It's about time someone took charge." "Can I count on you?" Cecelia asked, her voice low but earnest. "You have my support, Cecelia," Natalie replied, her eyes unwavering. "But you need to be careful. Elise is dangerous. She has a way of making everyone believe she's the victim." Cecelia nodded, knowing that Natalie was right. Elise's manipulations had always been her greatest weapon. But Cecelia was learning to play the game, and she wouldn't allow herself to be outmaneuvered. A week passed, and Cecilia's plan was starting to come together. She had gathered enough evidence to present a case to the board, and now it was time to confront her sister directly. It was late in the evening when Cecelia arranged to meet Elise in the boardroom. The lights were dim, and the room felt cold, unwelcoming. When Elise walked in, her eyes narrowed as she saw Cecelia standing there, papers spread out in front of her. "Cecelia, what's this about?" Elise asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a tension in her voice that Cecelia couldn't ignore. "I know what you've been doing," Cecelia said flatly. "The financial fraud, the corruption, the lies you've spread to keep control of this company. It ends now." Elise's face hardened, but she didn't back down. "You think you can just waltz back in here and take what's mine? You don't understand what's at stake, you never did." "You're wrong," Cecelia replied, her voice rising. "I understand exactly what's at stake. It's the future of this company, and it's mine to protect. You think you're going to ruin everything our father worked for?" Elise snapped, her voice shaking with fury. "You think you have the right to take it from me?" Cecelia took a deep breath, letting the tension hang in the air for a moment before she spoke again. "I'm not taking anything from you, Elise. I'm just taking back what's rightfully mine." The silence in the room was deafening as both sisters stared each other down, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Cecelia knew this was only the beginning. Elise would never back down without a fight, but Cecelia had already come too far to turn back. She was ready. Cecilia's confrontation with Elise marked the beginning of a new phase in her plan, one that would involve more strategic thinking and careful maneuvering. The stakes had never been higher, and Cecelia couldn't afford to make any mistakes. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized how much she had underestimated her sister. Elise was cunning, manipulative, and willing to do whatever it took to hold onto her power. And as Cecelia pressed forward, she found that every victory came at a cost. Elise wasn't going down without a fight, and Cecelia was about to learn just how far her sister was willing to go. End of chapter 3. In this chapter, Cecelia faces new challenges as she uncovers more of the corruption Elise has caused within the company. She starts to form alliances and gains some ground, but the battle is far from over. The chapter sets up the next stage of Cecilia's journey, where the stakes become even higher. Let me know if you'd like any revisions or if you'd like to continue with Chapter 4. 4 Mini, you said. Continue with next. Keep in mind the feedback of that comment. ChatGPT said, certainly. I'll continue with Chapter 4, keeping in mind the feedback from the comment. I'll focus on ensuring there's more conflict, character depth, and strategic maneuvers in the narrative. There should be a sense of tension as Cecelia faces her first major setback, and the chapter will be more grounded in emotional stakes, showing Cecilia's growth as a protagonist. Let's dive into Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The first pinch point. Cecilia's first major attempt to confront Elise had gone according to plan, or so she thought. The confrontation in the boardroom had left her feeling momentarily victorious. She had finally spoken out against her sister, and for the first time, Elise had seemed vulnerable. But as the days wore on, Cecelia began to realize how much of a precarious position she was in. Elise was no ordinary opponent, and the stakes were far higher than she had anticipated. In the days following their argument, Cecelia had expected Elise to retaliate. What she hadn't expected was just how quickly her sister would strike back. A costly mistake, Cecelia sat at her desk, late one evening, going through the final drafts of a proposal for a merger that could secure the company's future and bring much-needed capital. Her fingers skimmed the paper as she mulled over the numbers, but her mind kept drifting to Elise. What was her next move? Just then, the door to her office opened, and Natalie stepped in, her face unusually pale. "Cecelia, you need to see this," Natalie said urgently, holding up a tablet. Confused, Cecelia took the device from her, and the moment she saw the headline, her heart sank. Company scandal, CEO's daughter allegedly involved in financial mismanagement. Cecilia's stomach twisted as she scrolled through the article. The piece, published by an anonymous source, outlined supposed evidence of financial fraud linked directly to Cecelia. There were even images of forged documents, purportedly signed by Cecelia, approving some of the shady transactions Elise had been using to cover her tracks. The article had been released on several business websites, and by morning it was spreading like wildfire. Elise had made her first move. "What is this?" Cecelia demanded, her voice tight with disbelief. "This is a complete lie." Natalie's face grew even more serious. "It's a smear campaign, Cecelia. Elise knows the board's starting to question her leadership, and she's trying to turn the tide in her favor. This will get people questioning your loyalty, and it'll make your position at the company untenable." Cecilia's heart raced. The article made it appear as though she had been involved in approving financial mismanagement on multiple occasions, something she hadn't done, not even remotely. She was being framed, and the web of lies was growing thicker by the minute. Cecelia didn't waste time. She immediately reached out to her lawyer, who confirmed her worst fear. The article wasn't just a rumor, it was calculated. Elise had arranged for the evidence to appear authentic, planting forged documents in a way that could be linked directly to Cecilia's name. It was a methodical, professional attack. But why? Why would Elise go this far? She had already taken control of the company, and yet now she was trying to destroy Cecilia's credibility completely. There was only one explanation. Elise wanted Cecelia to give up, and Cecelia knew this would be only the first of many attempts to tear her down, but there was no backing down now. She had already come too far. That night, After hours of brainstorming how to counter the accusations, Cecelia made a decision. She needed more than just her family's support. The people who were still loyal to her father had to see the truth, and she needed to find a way to expose Elise's lies without playing directly into her hands. Cecelia reached out to an old acquaintance, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Adam Knight. He had been her father's chief financial officer for a long time and had left after a bitter fallout with Elise. The company had gone downhill after he left, and his expertise was sorely needed now. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before Adam picked up. "Cecelia, I wasn't expecting your call." Adam's voice was gruff, as though he hadn't used it in a while. "What's going on?" "I need your help, Adam," Cecelia said, her voice filled with urgency. "It's about the company. Elise has gone too far, and I need someone who knows the ins and outs of the finances to help me expose her. I need you to go over the books and find a way to disprove what she's planted against me. There's more going on than just a few fraudulent transactions. She's been covering her tracks for months." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Adam spoke. "You don't know what you're asking, Cecelia. Elise has too many people on her side now. If you think you can turn this around by going after her financially, you're going to make a lot of enemies. You're already fighting a battle you don't fully understand." "I understand it better than you think," Cecelia replied, her voice hard. "And I'm not backing down, not now." Adam let out a deep sigh. "I'll help you, but this is dangerous. You're walking into a trap." "I'll take that risk," Cecelia said firmly, "but I need your help." "I'll do what I can," Adam said, though his tone remained wary. "But remember, it's not just the company at stake. Elise will do anything to protect herself, and she's already proven she's willing to burn everything down to win." Taking action the next day, Cecelia and Adam met at a coffee shop outside of the city. The air was crisp, and Cecelia couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation on her shoulders as she waited for Adam to arrive. He showed up with a stack of documents, his face serious. "I went through the files. It's worse than I thought," he said, sliding the documents across the table to Cecelia. She flipped through them quickly, her mind racing as she took in the evidence. Adam had found discrepancies in the financial reports. Large amounts of money had been funneled out of the company's accounts into offshore accounts that no one had noticed until now. It was clear Elise had used every trick in the book to cover up her tracks, but Adam's thorough analysis had uncovered the truth. Cecelia smiled for the first time in days. "This is it," she said. "We can prove her corruption, we can end this." But as she looked at Adam, something about his expression made her hesitate. There was still a lingering unease in his eyes. "You're not out of the woods yet," Adam warned. "Elise will retaliate, and it's not just financial. She'll try to destroy you personally, too. She's already got the media on her side. If you go public with this, you risk making yourself an even bigger target." Cecelia nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I'm prepared for whatever comes next. This is the only way forward." Cecilia's heart beat faster as she prepared for the next move. She had the evidence, she had allies, but she was about to face a battle unlike anything she had imagined. Elise was ruthless, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. The stage was set, and Cecelia knew there was no turning back now. She was going to take down the woman who had tried to steal her birthright and ruin everything her father had worked for. But the path ahead was treacherous, and every decision she made would bring her closer to victory or to disaster. The weeks following Cecilia's confrontation with Elise were filled with tension, a growing unease that gnawed at her. Despite having the evidence, despite the temporary sense of victory, Cecelia couldn't shake the feeling that Elise was always one step ahead. It was as if her sister was playing a much larger game, one that Cecelia was only beginning to comprehend. The fallout from the smear campaign had affected Cecelia more deeply than she was willing to admit. The once solid support from her father's old colleagues had begun to waver. There were hushed conversations behind closed doors, glances exchanged in boardrooms that made Cecelia feel more isolated than ever. Even though she had the documents to prove Elise's corruption, the media storm was far from over, and many people still questioned her loyalty to the company. Cecelia found herself waking up early every day, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. The walls of her luxurious apartment, once a comforting refuge, now seemed suffocating. She hadn't spoken to her mother in weeks, and Natalie was always too busy with her own work to offer much in the way of support. She stared out the window at the city skyline, wondering how much longer she could keep fighting. The tension was growing unbearable. It was in the midst of this pressure that Cecelia received an unexpected call. "Miss Hawthorne, we've managed to confirm the accounts Elise has been using. They're linked to several companies overseas, but we need your authorization to access the full records." The voice on the other end was familiar, one of the company's top investigators. They had been working behind the scenes to dig deeper into Elise's web of deceit, and this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. "We need your signature," the investigator continued. "Without it, we can't move forward with the investigation." Cecelia hesitated for a moment. The timing felt almost too perfect, too convenient. Was it a trap? Could Elise be orchestrating this to further damage her reputation? But the weight of the situation bore down on her. She couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. "I'll sign it," Cecelia said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. Within hours, the documents were signed, and Cecelia sent them off with a feeling of finality. She had made her move. There was no going back now. The unexpected betrayal the next morning, the media hit with a vengeance. Breaking news: Cecelia Hawthorne's corporate takeover, her father's legacy at risk. The headline blared from her phone's screen. Cecilia's pulse quickened as she opened the article, her eyes scanning the words with increasing disbelief. The piece claimed that Cecelia was attempting to wrest control of the company from Elise, an outright power grab. The author, a journalist known for his close ties to Elise, had painted Cecelia as the villain, making it seem as though she was betraying her father's legacy for personal gain. The worst part, the article referenced Cecilia's recent actions, her meeting with the investigator, the documents she had signed, and spun them into evidence of her underhanded tactics. "Damn it," Cecelia muttered under her breath, slamming the phone down onto her desk. The betrayal stung worse than anything else she had experienced. It wasn't just Elise orchestrating this, it was a coordinated effort, and Cecelia realized just how deep Elise's influence ran. Frustrated and feeling more isolated than ever, Cecelia called Adam again. She needed his insight, his level-headedness in this storm of lies. "Adam, I need help," Cecilia's voice cracked with exhaustion. "They've turned the story around. They're painting me as the villain now." Adam was silent on the other end for a long moment. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but this is exactly what Elise wants. She'll twist everything you do, every move you make. You've got to stay ahead of her, Cecelia. Don't let her control the narrative." "But how do I fight back when everything's been twisted against me?" Cecilia's voice was small, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time: vulnerability. Adam sighed. "We fight back with the truth. You've got to expose what Elise has been hiding. I've already got someone on the inside. You're not as alone as you think." A week later, Cecelia was sitting in a small, dimly lit office in a hidden corner of the city, her heart pounding in her chest. She had met with Adam's contact, a former employee of the company who had worked closely with Elise for years. The man was nervous, shifting in his seat as he handed her a file filled with papers. "This is it," he said in a low voice. "Proof that Elise has been siphoning funds through offshore accounts for years. These transactions are all linked to shell companies under false names, but I've traced them all back to her." Cecelia couldn't help the surge of triumph that coursed through her. For the first time, she had the upper hand. "This is enough to take her down," she said, almost in disbelief. The man nodded, his eyes shifting nervously. "You'll need to be careful, though. Elise won't go down without a fight. She's already got people on the inside. I'm telling you, you're walking into dangerous territory." "I'm prepared," Cecelia replied, her voice steely with determination. But as Cecelia left the meeting, the weight of the task ahead began to sink in. She now had the proof, the weapon she needed to expose Elise, but the real battle was just beginning. Elise would fight tooth and nail to protect her empire, and Cecelia knew that everything she did from now on would be scrutinized. The media was still painting her as the villain. She had to be careful with every move she made, each word she spoke. One misstep, and it would all fall apart. But as Cecelia reviewed the documents, as she prepared for the final confrontation, something shifted inside her. She had spent so long fighting to prove herself, to earn the respect she deserved, that she hadn't realized what was at stake. It wasn't just the company anymore. It was her legacy, her identity. The world was watching, and Cecelia knew that she had to be smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than ever before. The game was no longer about surviving, it was about winning. The tension inside Cecelia was palpable, a constant weight she could never quite shake. The victory she'd felt when obtaining Elise's offshore account records had come at a steep price. The media had erupted with new accusations. This time, they painted Cecelia as a power-hungry traitor who was using her father's legacy to manipulate the company and force out her sister. No matter how much evidence she had, the media storm continued as Elise's supporters twisted the narrative in their favor. The worst part wasn't the headlines or the rumors. It was the isolation. People who had once seemed like allies were now cautious, walking on eggshells around her. The board members that had backed her, some of them had begun to question their support. Her father's old friends were no longer returning her calls, and some of them had even distanced themselves from the Hawthorne name. All Cecelia had left was her determination, her sharp intellect, and the slim hope that she could somehow wrest control back. It was a Friday evening when Cecelia sat alone in her office, staring out at the city lights from the floor to ceiling windows. The building was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. She hadn't gone home in days. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and yet she couldn't let herself stop. Not now. Not when everything she had worked for was teetering on the edge. "Why do I feel so alone?" she whispered to herself. The phone on her desk buzzed, and she saw Adam's name flash across the screen. She answered immediately. "Cecelia, I've got news." Adam's voice was calm but urgent. "The board meeting is scheduled for Monday. Elise has arranged everything. She's got the majority of the votes, and she's going to push for a full takeover of the company. If you don't do something fast, you'll be out." Cecilia's heart skipped a beat. It was everything she had feared. Elise had managed to play the long game, securing her position, buying influence, and manipulating those around her. It was exactly what Cecelia had been up against, and now it seemed as though Elise had the upper hand. But how? Cecilia's voice was hoarse with frustration. How could she have done this? I thought I had enough to expose her. Adam was quiet for a moment, his tone shifting to something more contemplative. Sometimes the truth isn't enough. People don't want to hear it unless it benefits them. Elise knows how to play that game better than anyone. Cecelia felt a cold pang in her chest. So, what do? We need to get to the heart of it. You can't just attack her from the outside. You've got to find a way to expose her weaknesses from the inside. Dig deeper into the family's finances, find something that'll shake her foundation. Cecelia leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. I don't know if I have the strength left to do this. Strength doesn't matter, Adam replied. It's all about intelligence, about staying one step ahead of her. We can do this if you stay focused. Monday arrived far too quickly. Cecelia stood before the boardroom, the weight of the upcoming vote pressing down on her like an unrelenting force. The meeting had been called to address the ongoing leadership struggles within Hawthorne Enterprises. Elise, sitting at the head of the table with a smug smile, had already begun speaking about her vision for the company. Her words were carefully chosen, persuasive, and painted her as the only one who could restore stability to the company. But Cecelia knew better. It wasn't stability Elise was after. It was complete control. If Elise got the majority vote, there would be nothing stopping her from ousting Cecelia permanently. Cecelia took her seat, steeling herself as the members of the board took their places around the table. She glanced at her father's old associates, who were already shifting uncomfortably, their loyalty to the company in doubt. The stakes had never been higher. As the meeting progressed, Cecelia tried to remain calm, listening to Elise's hollow rhetoric. It was all the same, appealing to the need for a strong, steady leader, someone who had family values and a clear vision for the future. It was exactly the kind of narrative that could win the board over. Cecelia needed something drastic to shift the momentum in her favor. Then, it hit her. The breakthrough she needed wasn't something external. It was within the company, buried under layers of corporate red tape and family secrets. There was one person in the room who had always been close to Elise, but had a track record of questionable behavior: Aidan, her father's old lawyer, who had always been by her side during critical moments. Aiden had been instrumental in signing off on many of the contracts during the company's expansion, including several large transactions that Cecelia knew were questionable. What if Aiden's involvement was more than just legal oversight? What if he had helped Elise manipulate the company's finances? She needed to investigate Aiden's role more thoroughly. Cecelia excused herself from the meeting, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to lose her focus, and if Aiden was complicit in Elise's schemes, he was the key to unraveling everything. Later that day, Cecelia met with Adam in a secluded cafe, far away from the prying eyes of the media and company associates. "I think I've found something," Cecelia said, her voice low. "Aiden, he's been involved in some of the financial dealings that don't add up. I need you to look into him, see if he's been part of Elise's plan from the start." Adam nodded, his expression focused. "I'll dig into it, but we need to be careful. If Aiden's been in on this, we'll need solid proof to bring him down." "I'll do whatever it takes," Cecelia replied, her voice tight with determination. "I can't let her win." The days that followed were a blur of investigation and strategy. Cecelia was consumed with finding more evidence, sifting through the financial documents, and keeping her every move under tight control. The board meeting loomed over her like an impending storm, and every piece of new information added more weight to her already heavy shoulders. As the week wore on, Cecilia's confidence began to waver. She could see the cracks forming in her defenses, her allies were growing more distant, and the media's portrayal of her as an opportunist continued to spread like wildfire. But she couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. She had already sacrificed too much to back down. With Adam's help, Cecelia uncovered a hidden set of transactions involving Aiden. It was more than she had hoped for, proof that Aiden had signed off on illegal deals designed to siphon money from the company's offshore accounts, transactions that Elise had used to fund her rise to power. Cecilia's pulse quickened as she looked over the evidence. This was it. With this, she had the leverage to expose Elise once and for all. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming her future, her legacy. The tension inside Cecelia felt like a storm waiting to break. Despite everything she had discovered, the secret transactions, the lies, the hidden accounts, she knew that simply having the truth wasn't enough. The world didn't work on truth alone, it worked on power, influence, and control. And right now, it was Elise who held all the cards. By the time the next board meeting arrived, Cecilia's nerves were frayed. She stood in front of the full table of executives and board members, the weight of their gazes making her feel more exposed than ever. Elise had already secured the votes of a few key members, and the rest were likely swayed by the media storm that painted Cecelia as the villain of the family drama. Cecelia had fought tooth and nail for the company's future, and yet, despite everything she had done, she stood on the precipice of failure. The evidence she had gathered, the financial discrepancies she had uncovered, it was all there, clear as day. But no one seemed willing to listen to her. Everyone had already made up their minds. Elise had done it again. She had managed to twist the narrative, making Cecelia the villain and herself the victim. She was the compassionate one, the one who cared about the family legacy, while Cecelia was painted as the cold, calculating, power-hungry daughter. The meeting had begun, and Cecelia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Elise's voice was smooth, persuasive, as she presented her case for why she should take over the company. She spoke about the future, about stability, and about what she was willing to do to protect the family's wealth. It was all a performance. Cecelia could see right through it. But it didn't matter. Elise had the audience on her side. The votes were already swaying in her favor. Cecelia tried to remain composed, but deep down, she felt the sting of betrayal. How had she let herself get to this point? How had she allowed Elise to manipulate her so effectively? As the meeting continued, Cecilia's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a way to turn the tide in her favor. She couldn't just stand there and let Elise take everything. But before she could make a move, a sudden comment from one of the board members hit her like a punch to the gut. "You know, I've been thinking," said Charles, one of the senior board members who had always been somewhat neutral in the family politics. "Cecelia, you've done well with the company so far, but there's something about Elise's vision that feels more genuine. I think we need to support her now. She's clearly the one who can bring the stability this company needs. Cecilia's throat tightened, and her hands clenched into fists. Charles's words weren't just a personal betrayal, they were the final nail in her coffin. Elise had managed to turn everyone against her, painting Cecelia as a liability. Cecelia had fought for the company's survival, but now she was the one being cast aside. For the first time since all of this had started, Cecelia felt completely helpless. The board had turned on her, the media had vilified her, and her father's legacy was slipping away from her grasp. All of her hard work, her determination, the sacrifices she had made, it didn't matter anymore. She was losing. The weight of it all crashed down on her, and she suddenly felt small, insignificant. The walls of the boardroom seemed to close in on her, suffocating her. For a moment, all she could hear was the thumping of her own heart in her ears. Cecelia? Adam's voice cut through her thoughts, low and urgent. He was sitting next to her, his face etched with concern. Don't do this. Don't let her win. You've come this far. You still have the power to stop her. But Cecelia wasn't so sure anymore. She felt like she was sinking, her mind clouded with doubt. She had always believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she could prove herself, she would be able to take back control. But now, it felt like nothing she did mattered. Elise had won. That night, Cecelia couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind consumed with the events of the day. She had poured everything into her fight for the company, and yet here she was broken, defeated. Her thoughts turned to her father, to everything he had built. He had always believed in her, trusted her to carry on the family legacy, but she couldn't help but wonder if he would have been disappointed in her now. Was she really worthy of his trust? Had she failed him? Cecelia sat up, her head in her hands, fighting back tears. It felt as if the world was slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She had been so focused on the power struggle, on reclaiming control, that she hadn't considered the emotional toll it was taking on her. She had lost sight of why she was fighting in the first place. It wasn't just about the company, it was about her family, her future, and her own identity. She had worked her entire life to prove that she was worthy of her father's legacy, but now she wasn't sure what was left to fight for. The next day, Cecelia had to face the reality that things weren't going to get any better. She met with Adam, who was equally shaken by the board's decision. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Adam, Cecelia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like everything I've worked for is slipping away. I don't know how to fight anymore. Adam reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. You don't have to fight alone. We're in this together. But Cecelia wasn't so sure anymore. She had given everything, her time, her effort, her family, and yet it felt like none of it mattered. The world had turned against her, and Elise was on the verge of taking everything she had worked for. The days that followed the board meeting felt like a blur to Cecelia. After the crushing defeat, she threw herself into her work, trying to regain control of the company's operations, even though it seemed like everything she did only propelled Elise's rise. But Cecelia refused to let herself fall any further. She had to fight back, even if her enemies seemed to have the upper hand. Late one night, as the glowing lights of her office reflected off the glass windows, Cecelia stared at the reports in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. She could hear the sound of her own breath as she closed her eyes, hoping for a glimpse of clarity. You don't have to do this alone, Adam's voice echoed in her mind, as it had on countless other occasions when she was ready to give up. The words he had spoken to her earlier were a lifeline she clung to. She may have been alone in this battle, but Adam had remained by her side, reminding her of her strength when she doubted herself. The bond between them had grown since the beginning of this conflict. Adam had been a rock for her, quietly offering support when she needed it most. The trust they had built now felt like something she couldn't afford to lose. But in this game of high stakes, there were no guarantees. Tomorrow, Cecelia muttered to herself, tomorrow we make our move. The plan had been forming for days now, slowly, carefully, step by step. Cecelia knew that she couldn't fight Elise head-on with brute force anymore. She had to be smarter. If she wanted to reclaim control of her family's legacy, she needed to outwit her sister. Elise had succeeded by playing a political game, using charm and manipulation to sway opinions. It was time to play the game in a different way, a way that Elise wouldn't expect. The key, Cecelia realized, was leverage. Elise had been able to use the company's resources to further her position, but Cecelia knew the vulnerabilities hidden deep within the business. She had kept meticulous records over the years, noting every flaw in the financial system and every discrepancy in the management practices. Now, she could use those flaws against Elise. Her eyes scanned the stack of papers on her desk, financial reports, meeting minutes, documents she had personally gathered. Each page contained another piece of the puzzle. With this information, she could expose Elise's underhanded dealings, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, the deals made behind closed doors. It was a weapon, a way to not only clear her name, but also dismantle Elise's carefully constructed empire. The plan wasn't foolproof, but it was the only shot Cecelia had left. In the hours before the next meeting, Cecelia reached out to someone she hadn't considered until now, an unlikely ally. Jason Morty, a business rival, had been eyeing the company for years. He had no love for Elise or the way she had steered the company into troubled waters. Their interests had never aligned, but now Cecelia realized they could use each other. Her father had taught her that in the world of business, sometimes survival meant making difficult decisions. She had always tried to follow his principles, but her father was gone now. Cecelia was left to make choices on her own, and Jason was the best option. She arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe in the city, a neutral space where they could discuss terms without the prying eyes of Elise's allies. Jason was already seated when Cecelia arrived, his cold gaze lifting from the papers he was reviewing. His presence always reminded her of the cutthroat nature of the world they lived in. He wasn't a man of alliances or loyalty, he was a man of opportunity. "You're looking well, Cecelia," he said, his voice smooth, yet there was an underlying edge to it. He didn't have the same warmth as Adam, but that was why he could be useful. He didn't care about morals, he cared about results. "I don't need pleasantries," Cecelia replied, her tone steady. She wasn't here to play games. "I need your help." Jason raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Go on." "I have information about Elise," Cecelia began, her voice low, careful. "Something that could take her down, something that will guarantee you control of the company." Jason leaned in, his interest piqued. "Go on." "I know about the hidden funds," Cecelia continued. "I know about the falsified reports and the off-the-books transactions she's been orchestrating with certain board members. I've spent months gathering evidence, and now I can make it public. All I need is your support." Jason's lips curled into a smirk. "And what do you want in return?" Cecelia didn't hesitate. "I want her out. You can take control of the company, but I want to be the one to call the shots when it comes to our family legacy. I'll need some assurances that you won't betray me once the deed is done." Jason studied her, and for a moment, Cecelia felt like he could see right through her. She wasn't afraid of him, she had too much at stake. But the thought of working with someone like him, someone so ruthless, sent a chill down her spine. "I'll help you," Jason finally said, his voice measured. "But once we're done, we're done. I don't do favors." Cecelia nodded. She knew this alliance was fragile, but it was the best chance she had. With Jason's help, she could leverage the documents she had gathered and expose Elise for everything she was. The day of the next board meeting arrived. Cecelia walked into the conference room, her mind sharp, her thoughts clear. This was it, the moment of truth. She had Jason on her side, she had the evidence, and now it was time to act. As she sat at the table, the weight of the board members' stares pressing on her, Cecelia felt the familiar sting of being judged. Elise sat across from her, her confident smile radiating an almost unnerving calm. She didn't know what Cecelia had up her sleeve, but she would soon find out. Adam sat next to her, offering a quiet smile of encouragement. He knew what this meant for her. He knew the risks. This was her last chance. "I'm going to expose everything," Cecelia whispered to herself, the words a mantra. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about showing Elise and the world that Cecelia was not the weak sister, the one who could be pushed aside. She had spent too long watching her sister get everything she wanted, but now, it was Cecilia's turn to take control. The air was thick with tension as Cecelia sat at the head of the boardroom table, flanked by Adam and Jason. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her, some filled with curiosity, others with suspicion. Elise sat across from her, her gaze unwavering, but Cecelia could see the subtle flicker of unease beneath her composed exterior. Elise knew something was about to happen, she just didn't know what. "I'm glad we could all gather here today," Cecelia began, her voice steady and measured. "There are some matters that need to be addressed, matters that concern the future of this company." The murmurs around the table faded as the board members leaned forward. Cecelia could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on her, but she stood tall, resolute. This was the moment she had prepared for. This was the moment she would take back everything Elise had stolen. Elise's lips curled into a thin smile, as though trying to play the role of the confident leader, but Cecelia could see the subtle shift in her sister's posture. She was beginning to doubt herself. "I've been reviewing some of the company's financial reports," Cecelia continued, her tone casual but deliberate. "And I came across some discrepancies, ones that I'm sure you'll all find interesting." The room fell silent, the tension thickening with each passing second. Elise's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She knew what Cecelia was implying, and she had no idea how to stop it. Cecelia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with documents, each one meticulously organized. She slid the folder across the table, allowing it to land in front of the board members. "This," Cecelia said, "is just a small portion of the evidence I've gathered. Evidence that proves Elise has been manipulating financial records, falsifying reports, and making deals under the table with some of our business rivals." There was a collective gasp from the board. Elise's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure, trying to salvage what little control she had left. "This is slander," Elise exclaimed, her voice rising. "You can't just accuse me without proof." "Oh, but I have proof, Elise," Cecelia replied calmly. "I've spent the last several weeks collecting every shred of evidence I could find. You've been siphoning funds into private accounts, making unauthorized investments, and even colluding with rivals to weaken the company from within." The room erupted in whispers, and Cecelia could see that the board members were beginning to turn against her sister. They had always respected Elise's charisma, her ability to charm them with her charm and promises. But now, the truth was laid bare, and Cecelia knew there was no way for Elise to talk her way out of it. Elise's hands shook slightly, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape, but there was nowhere left to run. Cecelia had anticipated this moment, and now, Elise's lies were about to unravel. "Are you seriously going to let her do this?" Elise turned to one of the board members, her voice desperate. "You know this is all fabricated." But the board members were no longer listening. They were staring at the documents, reading through the carefully compiled evidence, their expressions changing from skepticism to disbelief. One of the senior members, a woman with silver hair, cleared her throat. "Cecelia, these documents are legitimate. We've verified them." Cecelia felt a surge of triumph, but she didn't let it show. She had fought too hard to let herself get lost in the moment. This wasn't just about proving Elise wrong, it was about reclaiming her family's legacy. "Your actions have jeopardized this company," Cecelia continued, her voice unwavering. "And for that, you will have to answer for it." Elise looked around the room, her expression one of desperation. She had always thought she was untouchable, that her charm and manipulation would shield her from consequences. But now, in front of everyone, her world was collapsing. "You think this is over?" Elise sneered, her voice venomous. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a puppet in their game, Cecelia. You always have been." Cecilia's heart clenched at her sister's words, but she pushed the feeling aside. She wasn't going to let Elise drag her down again. "No, Elise, this is over for you." The finality in her voice rang through the room, and for the first time in a long while, Cecelia felt like she was truly in control. The board members looked at each other, exchanging glances before nodding in unison. "We'll begin the process of removing you from your position," the silver-haired board member announced, her voice cold but resolute. Elise's face twisted with rage. She stood up, slamming her fist onto the table. "You can't do this. I built this company. I deserve this." But Cecelia didn't flinch. Not anymore. With that, Cecelia turned to Adam, her trusted ally, and nodded. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, where a projector screen flickered to life. On the screen was a simple slide, a list of the board members who had voted to remove Elise from her position. "Now," Adam said, "let's make sure everyone understands the consequences of their actions." The The board members watched in stunned silence as Adam revealed the next part of the plan, Cecilia's rise to the top. The days following the board meeting were a blur for Cecelia. News of Elise's downfall spread like wildfire, the once celebrated heiress now a cautionary tale. For years, she had lived in the shadows of her manipulations, and yet in the end, it was Cecelia who had outlasted her. Cecelia stood at the window of her office, overlooking the bustling city below. The high-rise towers glistened in the fading sunlight, the same city that had once been her battleground. The victory was sweet, but there was no sense of triumph in her heart. There was only a strange emptiness, a quiet satisfaction, as she realized the price of her success. The door to her office creaked open and Jason entered, his footsteps light yet purposeful. He didn't speak right away, as if waiting for Cecelia to acknowledge him. She didn't turn from the window, but she felt his presence behind her, a constant, grounding force in this storm of emotions. "You did it," Jason said, his voice low but proud. Cecelia didn't respond at first. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk in front of her, the surface polished to a mirror sheen. It was strange, everything had fallen into place. She had taken the company back from her sister, exposed her lies, and reclaimed what was rightfully hers. Yet the victory felt hollow. "I don't feel like I thought I would," Cecelia confessed, finally turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but the weight in her eyes told a different story. "I thought once I'd proven Elise wrong, once I'd taken the company back, I'd feel better." Jason stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You did what had to be done, Cecelia. You've worked for this for years. Don't let the weight of it blind you." "I know," she sighed, sinking into the chair behind her desk. Her fingers drummed against the wood, a nervous habit she had never quite grown out of. "But there's still something missing, something I didn't anticipate." Jason raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on her. "What do you mean?" Cecilia's lips quirked into a faint smile, though it lacked any true humor. "It's just everything I've done to get here. The sacrifices, the betrayals. I don't know who I am anymore." Jason's expression softened, and he moved around the desk to sit beside her. "You're Cecelia. You always have been. You're strong, independent, and capable. Don't let the past or the chaos of these last few months define you. You're in control now." For the first time in a long while, Cecelia allowed herself to breathe, to let her guard down just a little. She had fought for so long, against her sister, against the board, against everything that had tried to hold her back, that she had forgotten what it meant to just be. To live. "I've always been trying to live up to something," she murmured, staring at the papers on her desk. "To prove myself worthy. To prove I was more than just the quiet one who was always overlooked." Jason's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture that meant more than words ever could. "You've proven that, and more." Cecilia's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. There was a warmth in his touch, a genuine connection that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. She had spent so much time focused on her ambition, on winning, that she had neglected the most important thing of all, her own happiness. "I've been so caught up in the idea of power," Cecelia admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm realizing now that power doesn't define me. It doesn't make me who I am." Jason met her gaze, his eyes kind and understanding. "Then what does?" Cecelia took a deep breath, a soft smile playing at her lips. "It's the people who care about me. The ones who see me for who I truly am, not just as a pawn in a game." There was a long pause as Jason's words sank in. The tension that had plagued Cecelia for so long seemed to dissipate in that moment, leaving her feeling lighter than she had in ages. Perhaps the victory hadn't been about taking back control of the company. Perhaps it had been about finding herself again, about learning that she didn't need to be defined by the chaos of her past. And then, in that quiet office, with the city stretching out before her, Cecelia realized something she hadn't before. She was finally free. The phone on her desk buzzed, breaking the silence. Cecelia picked it up without hesitation, her fingers brushing the screen to accept the call. "It's done," a voice on the other end said, Adam's voice calm and professional as always. "We've finalized the paperwork. The board has formally voted you in as CEO. You're in control now." Cecelia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. The weight of the moment settled over her, but this time it was different. She had earned this. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll make sure we're ready for the next phase." After hanging up, Cecilia placed the phone back on the desk. Jason was still there, watching her with an unspoken question in his eyes. You did it, he said, a proud smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You're the one in charge now. Cecilia smiled back at him, her heart finally at ease. Yes, but more importantly, I know who I am now, and that's enough. The sun had set by the time Cecilia stood up from her desk, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She had won, yes, but the real victory was in reclaiming herself. The world was hers to shape, and for the first time in her life, Cecilia felt truly ready to embrace it. As she walked out of the office, Jason at her side, Cecilia knew that the road ahead would be challenging. But now, with her own sense of self firmly in place, she was ready to face whatever came next. The future was hers, and she would make it her own.